So thank you so much for inviting me, Earl. I've been to Austin a couple of times, but never been to the university, so I'm really excited to be here. So as Earl mentioned, I'm in Microsoft Research. I've been there for about 5 years now. And as he also highlighted that I'm now in the ability research team, which focuses on kind of empowering people across a variety of abilities. But we're also looking at some different meeting agents. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Up to like a month ago, the last 4.5 years, I've been in the software analysis and intelligence and engineering systems group. So again, primarily previously focused on developer experiences, and the main core of the work I'll talk about today is work I've done in that space for developer communities. And I'll outline a little bit of my work in that space for folks who may not be just familiar with that. Okay. So for the course of this talk, I'll be covering a lot of some early investigations that we've done in generative AI settings for developers. Thinking about, Copilot as one of those core ones that kind of released quite some time ago. I'm also going to be diving deep into how communities currently function and what can be enabled in them. I'm also kind of lead us through some specters of opportunities, but to do that, I'm going to outline some recent research that's been highlighting how people use communities to learn about. Sorry, that light is bothering me. How people use communities to engage and learn, and that collective sense making that happens there. So I'm going to be specifically outlining that and maybe different ways we can empower and enable that with some of the agents that are available now. And then finally, I'm going to close with some of the speculative research, some early findings we're having from some recently released and recently published work, and thinking about what that may mean for the future of agents in communities. I think Earl mentioned we could do questions at the end, so I'm here till to the end, so we can go through that. So for those who may not be as familiar with me or my work, again, I previously traditionally work in the software engineering space. So I'm looking at mainly conferences like ICSI, FSC. On the HCI side, there's Kai, there's Chase, which is a cooperative human aspect of software engineering, which is an interdisciplinary conference in itself, where a lot of folks who do post at CSCW and BLHCC and Kai, who also do software engineering, meet there. I see some folks nodding, so maybe some folks are familiar with that venue as well. So meeting of the minds. And then again, a lot of my work is focused on communities. And so online communities, I'll highlight some work that is focused on internal developer communities within Microsoft that we've been investigating. But most of the work that I'll talk about today has been focused on open source settings and what that enables and empowers. And then of course, like everyone else, there's like, okay, and AI is the intersection of all those things. So essentially that's what this talk will be kind of covering. How we're able to kind of leverage existing tools, how people are learning about existing tools or learning how to leverage existing tools through these communities as well. So private meta analysis as well. Okay. So communities have always been a great resource for helping us make sense of new technologies. Communities are a place we go to when we're, sometimes a little bored and want to offer help and support to others, when we're wayfinding, when we're lost on a new problem or a new challenge. But it can also be a way for us to kind of donate our time and participate in altruistic opportunities. With these onset of these new generative AI tools, communities has also been really helpful of learning how to navigate the new world. When we think about the tools like GitHub Copilot, in a similar vein, they've also been helpful for new tools like GitHub Copilot. They have shifted the way we work. They have shifted how we engage in tools specifically for developers, and I'll talk about the way developers have work has been changing. But us as this research scientists, like developers, also resort to these settings to kind of learn more about how to use them, how to navigate the latest boundaries we should be adhering to, the latest guidelines, and also what works and what doesn't work. And developers are no different from that. So I like to kind of close it back. I think sometimes as a researcher, we forget that sometimes we are programmers for a purpose, or as I guess Mary Shaw refers to as like vernacular programmers. So I'll start referencing a lot of the early GitHub Copilot tools. GitHub Copilot, for those, actually raise your hand if you're familiar with GitHub Copilot. Okay, cool, so after. So GitHub Copilot kind of came out with a technical preview in 2021. And for those who are not familiar with GitHub Copilot, this is an example of a video of it in the IDE, where you're able to kind of read a suggestion or have a suggestion provided for you and hit accept or decline it. some of the early work we were doing was really figuring out how developers were wayfinding about this new tool. In summer of 2021 or the November of 2021, when we started releasing this, conducting the study, being at Microsoft Research, we partnered with the GitHub team. One of the reasons that actually it worked out well, that we were able to kind of give some early insights on how this tool is going to be used, how it may not be used, how we may not want it to be used, I should say that. And then direct on what people are kind of using it for and how we can set templates or give guidance on what that looks like. So in October of 2021, we conducted this analysis of GitHub discussions. So for those of you who may not be as familiar, GitHub discussions is a tool that came out in probably about 2020 or so, 2021, which is GitHub's social Q&A platform. So similar to how Stack Overflow has their Q&A for questions, there's GitHub discussion questions that live bespoke to a project. So there's different community leaders and maintainers that engage there. And they kind of offer guidance separate from issues, separate from GitHub issues. But it's a great way to kind of encourage participation in a lower fidelity way that is not as daunting, because it's a new project. It's not the entire world of Stack Overflow looking at those who are familiar with this specific project. So we analyzed GitHub discussion. So we had developers who had access to a technical preview and were able to kind of engage on GitHub discussions and share their experiences of how they're using this new GitHub Copilot tool. We also conducted a couple additional studies. So we had a couple pilot studies with Python developers, and then we also did some additional analysis from a survey of over 2,000 developers about the usage metrics. One thing I do want to highlight on this slide, I forgot this clicker, is that we're seeing that participants were spending less time on Stack Overflow, but now have less of an understanding of how code works. So they were engaging on this platform, on this tool, right? They're learning how to use this new tool, this new AI agent, but there were new challenges presenting themselves. So they're spending essentially less time writing code, more time actually reviewing code, which requires a set of new skills, right? Pop that in. So less time writing code, more time reviewing, which means you have to have a different type of depth and understanding of what you're working on. So some of the backline or behind the scenes questions we're asking were, well, how do we help developers reason? Are the ways we can be encouraging developers to still seek out that reason, to still not be over reliant on these tools, but being able to adapt their knowledge in different ways. Of course, there were different challenges about API discoverability. I won't cover more of that, but there was more questions around how these things work. So again, where do you learn how things work? Sometimes you go back to communities to do that type of work. So what I've been talking about in the majority of the talk is understanding how communities can help us enable trust. They help us learn about new tools. We learn from other peers, other experts, even experts in a different with a different programming language can get familiar with the new programming language and how others are describing it. Yes, from adapting mental models, but also from learning how others are asking and talking about that. And it can also provide feedback in those ways. So I'm going to be outlining how communities can really help us enable trust. To do that, I'm leaning on this match model from Veer Lau, who's another researcher at Microsoft Research in Montreal, really has this really interesting format of thinking about how trust works. So when we look at, there's multiple parts, and I'll cover each of them. So we're thinking about models, she's thinking about the trustworthy attributes of a model, as in what are those cues, what are the characteristics of the model that influence and encourage our trust. System affordances. So when we think about trust, there are certain modalities and different cues that our tool is giving you, a system is giving you, that encourage you to trust it. What are some of the trustworthy cues? And then finally, figuring out whether or not you want to decide to trust or to move forward with the tool. That's how you develop your own judgment, your own heuristics. And that together, from all those things, you decide and you decide how exactly to move forward. So there's attributes of the system, there's affordances that are visibly available, and then there's judgments that you make internally before you decide what action you want to move forward with. And all of these exist within a system, within an AI system. So this is the existing match model, as Vera and Sundar kind of outline here. What we have been posing with our work is that, well, before you make the action and you decide what to do, there are certain there are other ways you decide to, things that influence how you decide to move forward, things that influence that action you want to take. And online communities, so socio-technical ecosystems are a good part of that. Before you decide to take an action, you may ask a colleague, or you may see what a colleague did, if you're unsure of what direction to go forward with, or exactly what the correct action to do is, what makes sense for your specific use case and context. And communities help you do that. So that's what's our positioning, that's what we were positing. And online communities are one example of that, of a new technology when you don't have access to a neighbor who knows how to use the tool. Because again, it's a new tool. It didn't exist yet. There's no textbook for this yet. So essentially, the textbook that folks are referencing and learning from is online. We're building the textbook of how people engage with these tools through looking at how they engage in online forums and how they share their experiences. And I'll talk a little bit about that more later. But we focus on online communities because they really help us inform the decisions and trust. And I want to kind of read this quote from Zhang et al. Verbatim. Trust is shaped by people's information seeking and assessment behaviors on practices through the emerging information platforms. So essentially, the platforms that they're using, the tools that they use, depends on what information they're looking for and what is their end goal. But the platforms and importance of these tools also inform that too. And we're keeping that in mind as well. I will be highlighting the one study that looks at how we use online communities to kind of influence or figure out what's valuable for online communities that will influence trust in engaging with new technologies. This Copilot, GitHub Copilot is one example of that, but there are also additional studies that we did that enable and understand affordances like confidence, how you can build new types of affordances on these platforms to engender appropriate trust. And I can talk about that later on too, but I just wanted to focus on community specifically for this time. Okay, so in order to understand how communities can influence, how the socio-technical ecosystem can influence how developers build trust, we asked two research questions for the study. One was, how do online communities shape developers' trust in AI code generation tools? And then two, how can we design and build to facilitate the trust in building an AI and using affordances that are existent online communities? So some of these affordances exist in online communities, like being able to vote, Q&A, kind of that type of formats of engagement that currently exists. And there's room for others. So for the first part of our study, we conducted these semi-structured interviews. I should also mention that in study 0, we kind of did an analysis. There's like thousands of posts that we did for study 0 to see how the frequency of people discussing these topics. But again, people, GitHub Copilot, this is 2021, GitHub Copilot wasn't available to the broader population yet. The developers were mostly speculating about what they would use the tool for. So that was kind of cool to see like the pie in the sky dream aspects of what they might these computing tools to be helpful for. But we weren't able to kind of recruit developers for that case. So we ended up recruiting developers internally within Microsoft for most of the study. So we recruited a mix of people who had access to the technical preview, familiar with a variety of platforms, and we wanted to get a better idea of the use cases of AI, their expectations. And I think what is important for me to highlight for this audience is that we are interviewing and investigating with the people who traditionally build these tools. So developers are the ones who build these tools, but now they're like the first and only consumer of this tool at this time. So all the other Microsoft Copilot products didn't exist in this scale yet. So we want to also really figure out what are their vulnerable situations that they may have a keen eye for, because they probably built tools that incorporated AI models, and they were trying to figure out, they know the challenges and risks that are associated with it. So they have a really unique expertise here that we're trying to leverage as well. For study 2, we really wanted to kind of get an idea and probe and figure out, well, if we were able to have access to a community, what would it look like? What affordances or attributes of the community will be helpful for you, will help you build trust, or help you build, understanding of what not to trust, right? So communities are a great way of doing that. So we wanted to figure out and probe what that would look like, and brainstorm what that would look like at scale. So we kind of built these design mode mock-ups and prototypes to kind of probe. Okay, so earlier, if you remember, I kind of highlighted the match model of trust here. Outside of this match model, when we're thinking about online communities and the subset of ecosystems that they kind of inform a lot of the knowledge, the beauty of online communities is that they have these community evaluation heuristics. So you're able to see, again, what others have posted, they're able to say what worked for them specifically and what not. And by viewing those, you're building your own understanding. It's reinforcing your own heuristics of like, okay, I trust this person's opinion, I would use it in a similar fashion. And that helps you learn and evaluate your own understanding of how these tools will work. So those are the community evaluation signals that exist in every community, but I'm trying to really ground it for the context of this too. Another beauty of online communities, which I'll highlight later, is that there's a second part, but I'll talk a little bit about the findings of the community evaluation statistics first. So regards to AI suggestions, these communities are really helpful for giving out transparent information, for instance, being able to have explicit and triangulation. So what developer communities and other settings as well, but I think it's really easier to kind of identify in developer communities is that you're able to say what you tried, what didn't work, and you can post your code, so you're gonna show your work. And ideally in other settings, outside developers, they have that as well too, but you can be really explicit about what the expectation of the outcome of the code snippet you're providing is supposed to do. There's also a set of credibility signals that are really helpful for developer communities, and oftentimes when we're referring to developer communities here,
Yes. Oh, no, share the screen and then just,
okay, sorry, I looked over and I said something.
The owl just unmuted, so that's good.
yes, so, it's starting to share your screen. Unfortunately.
Alright. Is there nothing shown on your screen?
Yeah, it's like, yeah.
Yeah, saying it's trying to share.
Okay, let me. I got it. Yay.
Hooray.
Got it, okay.
All right, intermission's over, guys.
Yeah.
That's over. It's still here, okay. And let me, wait. Next. Although, we can scroll. All right, let's see. Yes, I think I was on this slide. Yes, I don't think I highlighted this quote yet. So, sorry, folks, thank you for your patience as I have been, first of all. Okay, so community evaluation signals. So we interviewed developers, we were asking about what type of signals what do you get from communities that would be helpful in this scenario for AI code generation tools? So one developer went on to kind of highlight the ability to kind of garner trust in what others have said. So this participant goes on to say, the code has been posted by other programmers, people voted on it, so others lended their voice to this opportunity. And others have used the solution, they have said it worked, it did not work. That's the kind of the value, the meat of what you get from online communities that you wouldn't have otherwise. And it worked and it gives you a little bit more faith. I also again want to emphasize that in these, I think sometimes when we hear people talk about communities and online communities where like, okay, there's this one other source or one place to check. I think as we continue to see new technologies emerge and evolve, the first place we're gonna see people going to is community. That's gonna be the place where they have and have discussions around this work. So it's gonna be the novelty effect or the center of gravity of all the novelty is gonna be in these settings. So I guess I wanna emphasize that it's not just one more place. It is literally the only place in this. And then that leads to a lot of other discussions we can have later about how to, if this is the only place, we should be mindful and protect this place so it can be helpful and insightful for others. But that's a whole community safety guidelines we can talk about later. I mentioned the community evaluations, signals. So again, learning about community heuristics, building your own understanding based on how others have used this platform. Another format that we're thinking about for socio-technical ecosystems influencing this model of trust is the community curated experiences. So essentially, this is how others have experienced, and we're kind of learning about how people built reasonable and appropriate trust in these tools. Learning again about specific experiences, how they have strategies and built strategies, so built their own navigation patterns, their own approaches to engaging with these tools and how they would use them in the future. And it's the same way we think about empirical approaches for how we conduct studies. New community members or community members are learning and looking at other people's perspectives to build their own empirical understandings. And again, it will be bespoke to the individual, again, specific to their context. And this participant goes on. Okay. I said something wrong. Please don't restart again. This participant goes on to say, I read a bunch of what people think of the outcome. And it helps me make my own perception of whether it is something that is useful for me or not. If everyone has bad experiences in this use case that I care about, so again, the context is highlighted, the use case that I care about, I won't trust it at all. Otherwise, I can know where to be careful, what to avoid in the future. But also go on to say, I can also know what to recommend or refer to others who also may not have access to this platform.
Very quick clarifying question. They're sharing suggestions, like the prompt and the suggested code that Copilot is making?
Yes, so people are sharing that in the GitHub discussions forums.
Okay, cool.
And technically they're public for people who, because everyone couldn't see, everyone had access to the tool, but you could see the discussions.
Oh, okay, interesting. So were they shooting screenshots for that, or were they copying it over? What were they putting in place?
Yeah, so it was in Markdown, the same way you leave like issues and comments in other ways. So that's one way to do it. So people also kind of wrote their own blogs. So people had access to the technical preview. They would write their own blogs.
So they link out to that.
Sometimes, yeah. So it's a mix of both.
Yeah.
Because their primary format or access was Markdown. So, yeah. And the same way you would do on GitHub issues. In fact, sometimes discussions can be really confusing for folks because they're like, how's it different from that? People establish boundaries of what this community would do. And we can talk about how norms get established, because essentially, as this new community emerged, there's also new norms being established around how we're going to describe this tool. Are we going to call it the AI, the age of GitHub Copilot, right? There's different language and understandings that people developed here. So good question. So now we talked about the model of trust. We have a better example of our community heuristics. We understand a little bit more about how the affordances of trust by looking at the different examples people have shared on these platforms, which also help us build our collective sense making. So again, we essentially have this library of how people have used this tool, which can inform us how we should set guidance on or templates or examples of how people should use it moving forward. There's also a big set of challenges as well in effectively using communities. Some of the big challenges that just been shared, with the lack of being able to have this context or replicability. You asked about, is it screenshots, right? It's not like you get the full context of the code that's available. You have what's available, and you could have a different platform where you share your whole code snippet as well. But that, in the current setting, at the time, there were not many reporting systems or many platforms that would do that for you. There's also this challenge of being able to effectively have a shared description of understanding how you're engaging or interacting with the agent. So there was not this shared vocabulary of how we're working together or how you are working with the agent. It's not common amongst folks yet. It's a new community, right? We're building the language and the dialogue around that as people are teaming. And then of course the diversity of responses. So being able to sift through the context, it was essentially you're using the search that's available to you. There wasn't there weren't several tabs yet. There wasn't like a Stack Overflow for AI yet, which kind of exists now. So this participant goes on to say, I once saw a really interesting Copilot suggestion and I wanted to try it myself. But I couldn't get the same prompt. I couldn't get it even using the same prompt. So this is just a general problem, with replicability of using AI agents overall. And I don't know what the user setup was. I don't know the full context, because again, Copilot uses the context that's available in your file and your code. So again, So it was interesting to see how some of the challenges that people had, you see these similar challenges beyond AI, like beyond developers using GitHub Copilot, but it was interesting because this is just the nature of the land, that is the new landscape we're in. It's gonna be challenging to replicate some of these same scenarios. You're not gonna get the same prompts or the same, you're not gonna get the same result every time. But that is a part of shaping the broader understanding of trust here. So we're essentially building a whole new way of thinking about trust and a whole new way of how we're thinking about using communities to help us build that trust, because it's gonna be less likely that you're gonna get that same response. But a bigger question is, now that we have all these insights from how developers would like to see communities work, how can we now redesign new communities around how developers build trust in AI? And one example of this is this design pro that we built. And I want to first start by saying this does not currently exist in product. This is just something we were positioning, we were hypothesizing about this, but there are certain affordances here that I think are relevant for how communities, what people traditionally get from online communities that are really insightful and helpful. Here we have the post snippet. You're able to see how many snippets were similar, as in this has been suggested by other users, to users in your organization. So again, this is an abstraction, right? No one's getting the same post snippet, but what we're saying is other folks were working on a similar type of code, and this is what their result was, and it was similar to yours. So again, you're not feeling that I'm the only one receiving this. This is a collective opportunity or collective sense of making. We're also able to kind of share number of exceptions, how many people accepted without edits, made edits, rejected directly. Again, you're able to see how others are tinkering and using a tool. And you would be able to see these as well if you had an online forum. But we wanted to focus on these broader community user statistics that are really helpful for understanding how others are using a tool, so you can understand, am I using the tool in a similar way? And what's valuable. We also have this community voting mechanism here. We're able to kind of give feedback, if you will, like, and share some of these experiences. So one of the, and this was intentionally, this wasn't just for cutesies, being able to share experiences is a big challenge in online platforms, online communities overall. So there's, online communities suffers from, majority of the people there are lurkers. And experts from a Stack Overflow in 2010, I think there was a stat that one of my colleagues had, especially that 65% of the community was answering, 5% of the community was answering 65% of the questions of Stack Overflow. And that's just the nature of online communities. There's a small group of experts or people who feel empowered to ask or answer questions. And there's another set of members here who would not even consider themselves members. They lurk, they observe, they consume, and then a smaller portion of those folks actually want to contribute but don't know how. So we were also exploring through our prototypes ways to kind of empower folks to contribute, which is a big challenge. Something I also want to highlight too is that when we're looking at some of the accepted without edits, we're able to kind of gather identity reputation signals. So people based on your expertise, your experience in the organization, it'd be helpful to know if other junior software developers or expert software developers found this helpful. Was this insightful to them? That type of information is stuff you also get implicitly from Stack Overflow, for example. Being able to see, oh, this person has this much reputation here. You can go to their profile. You can see what programming languages and tags they answered questions on or engaged on. And that type of information is helpful. So we wanted to figure out ways to kind of extend that here. The examples that I'm showing are from our work that was kind of published at ACM, Transactions of Intelligent Tutoring Systems, or Interactive Intelligence Systems, that's what it was. But I also want to highlight a few other concepts here that have not really made it to the fore yet. And I would also highlight this work is published in 2023, but we did this work in 2022, in 2021, actually following right after. We wanted to figure out how we can empower and enable participation. So one concept we wanted to tinker with was the ability to share. How do you make it easier for people to share their experiences? So what we created here, were clips of code snippets that folks were working on. So essentially, Copilot was referencing the code you were already working on. And if now we're telling you, oh, there's other examples of people who are doing something, working on a similar code snippet as you. how can we figure out how we can empower people to share that experience? Well, let me show you other examples of where people have done the same. Let me lower the barrier to entry to you, but let me show you how easy it is to kind of share. By also telling you, oh, here's a snippet of something you've been working on. We screen recorded this. This is a mock-up. This is not real. This wasn't, you were being mindful of surveillance, right? They knew these were mock-ups, for the most part, I think. But we were highlighting, okay, this is a clip that will be helpful to others. Let's empower you to share. And then you can decide if you want to or not. But let's lower the bar of like, I have to screen record, I have to give comments over it. Let's lower that bar to entry to make it just easier. And that's one of the big challenges for online communities. People want to share, they don't know how. People want to engage, they don't find those opportunities to do so. So we're trying to recreate that here. And some of the key findings we have here were that developers really wanted some scaffolding for their unique experiences. They wanted to be able to share, but they didn't, these existing prototypes that I showed you don't exist right now. They didn't exist, and they still don't exist after some years now. But I think there's some challenges we can navigate around proprietary information that's available there. They also wanted to figure out how to integrate into their workflows, which is one of the novel things about what we showed in that prototype. You're already working. We retroactively collected the snippet for you. You can decide, you can decline. You can decline to share, but it's available to you if you wanted to. And we can redact as much information as you wanted to, and you don't have to share it publicly to the entire world. We have different, you don't have to share it to your public GitHub, you can share it to your project specific one. We also have internal repository where developers are also engaging with one another. Let's share it there. So essentially, they were just trying to figure out ways to make it be valuable to their existing workflow. And one of the biggest concerns, of course, is the privacy and confidentiality. So because even though you're in a larger organization, there are certain projects and products that are not for everyone, even if they're in the same company. So you want to be able to be mindful of that. So there's opportunities to figure out better redaction and abstraction tools to empower sharing, to empower opportunities to engage in online communities in a more meaningful way or a deeper way. But I also want to, share some other opportunities. So are there additional ways you can leverage AI to better power Dev++? So not just official industry software developers, but people who are developers, who are programmers for a purpose, or like the vernacular programmers, for instance, that I mentioned. One example of that is Prompt Buddy. Are folks familiar with Prompt Buddy by chance? Okay, so Prompt Buddy is a tool that is essentially a community in a box. You can it's publicly available right now. You can't see it because of that little screen at the top, but I guess you can see the recording later on. Okay, because a lot of my links are at the top of the screen, sorry. So with Prompt Buddy, you can share your experiences across how you're working on different prompts for different Microsoft Copilot tools. And not just, you don't see GitHub Copilot here because it's a different suite essentially, but there's Microsoft Teams, there's Microsoft PowerPoint, and you can see the top prompts folks are working on within your organization, within your team. And this is publicly available and you can use this for different classroom settings as well. So I think what's interesting here is the sub communities aspect of this. And you kind of have a container on a grasp on who gets access to this. The confidentiality people are worried about, you can do that here. You can have a good graph on that here. So I think that's really great for understanding collective sense making, but in practice in different settings. And it's been developed by Microsoft developers, but it's not like a tool that to purchase. It's just available. Another one is ShareGPT, my favorite. Have folks heard of ShareGPT by chance? Okay, so a little bit, yes. Okay, so ShareGPT is an extension you can add on your browser, but you can actually just log online and scroll through and see examples of what people have shared, which is their ChatGPT prompts, and they have links so you can see the dialogue that people are engaging on them. So here, ShareGPT is a prompt that somebody created. You can see who's been engaging. And you can see who's been engaging and leaving comments and responding.
Avoid cryptocurrency.
Yeah. I did not endorse anything here, I'm just sharing. But what's interesting here is that you can see people had saved others' prompts and saved interactions, the type of experiences you couldn't get before, and you still don't have access to today on GitHub Copilot and these other tools. You can also see the visibility of it. So you can see the impact that your post has had, which is again, encouraging people to share. If you can see the level of impact it's had, you're like, oh, well, this is valuable and insightful to others. That's encouraging me to share more. There are certain affordances that communities offer, or certain, these attributes of being able to share, see the community's, user statistics. Vote and being able to empower folks in that way, that enable others to do the same. So ShareGPT is one I definitely recommend, just checking out and see how others have kind of reviewed their prompts. We didn't use that for our studies, but it was something that came about after we kind of conducted our main one. So I also want to highlight some other studies that are kind of floating in ethos I think are really helpful, that highlight how communities can be an insightful tool for learning how folks are using AI. So this work came out of some research from folks at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and a lot of folks from MS Azure AI. And their research questions here were they were essentially trying to figure out how to highlight new opportunities that we weren't covering yet. So their research question here was, what is the distribution of real world users and their queries based on domain and task and types? And how do we shift from the traditional NLP benchmarks? But also, what are those emerging opportunities that we haven't yet dialed in on? So what are those emerging opportunities people are using ChatGPT or any type of agent, Claude, Gemini, et cetera, for that we can learn from? And a highlight from their work is that they were reviewing community forums to be able to learn the latest, get a latest lens of what people are doing. So here is an example of the domain. They we're reviewing the domain and topics from ShareGPT, which is that example of the community I showed earlier, and Hugging Face as well, to figure out what people are sharing and talking about in regards to their prompts and their task types. What is kind of expected, as you see here, is code generation is the majority here, of course. So reading or code generation, being able to talk about technology, yes, makes sense. But what's also interesting is the reading comprehension. Being able to talk a little bit about the advice. This advice one is actually really interesting because authors in this work call this out as an opportunity of under exploration. So I think the really interesting thing about communities, or you're just even doing a lot of the mixed methods research, is that yes, you have your quantitative research and kind of amplify, you understand the prevalence of a finding, but there's also the beauty doing the qualitative part that mixed methods work is understanding the breadth, the long tail experiences that we don't talk enough about, but present opportunities for us to explore further. And that's one thing they highlight in this paper, that a lot of contributors, a lot of people sharing their experiences, were also highlighting seeking advice, navigating mental health challenges. They call this out multiple times in the paper actually, because it's an opportunity that we haven't really talked about much. This may be an opportunity to innovate and figure out how we can better support people who are experiencing these things. And these are, again, long tail distributions, but when people are using agents to kind of help navigate these situations, these are high impact opportunities. So again, in the way they found these was through communities. So the paper, I think the paper on the top of the slide there as well. Something also we're exploring was thinking about how AI can empower internal developer communities. So internal developer communities within an enterprise, a company like Microsoft. So we were looking at how metrics can really be a fundamental kind of challenge. Identifying the metrics are a challenge for developers or just anyone across engineering disciplines. But what's really interesting is if we're able to kind of leverage their expertise that exists, especially when we think about multidisciplinary opportunities. So in this work, we're actually thinking about how we can leverage expertise of multiple leaders in a space, help us devise new metrics. And here, this should have popped up earlier, but I guess it didn't. So essentially, we have a core goal. We want to leverage the expertise that may not be available because they have X amount of busyness stuff to do, but we wanted their insight in order to figure out how to replicate this study, basically. And we're leveraging their metrics by using AI to do that. So we do this process of iterative prompt priming, and I highlight this in the paper, of being able to refine what are these specific programmer metrics that we want to be able to focus on and be able to do this at scale. For this project, we mostly use open source data, but we're using data from open source communities where people have shared their expertise and their knowledge to help us refine, we are gathering the metrics of open source communities, but the experts are kind of renowned experts in the field. The point that I'm trying to make here is that we're able to leverage expertise, leverage data from the communities to be able to learn how we can build our own metrics. If we were able to kind of get the insight from a leader in the field that we don't normally have access to. How can we use that? How can we leverage that in conjunction with our specific context of the pull request history, the commit history, to be able to do that at scale within an organization? So that's kind of what we were doing here. And this work was recently published, or just publicly available on our archive site within Microsoft, our technical report. So I encourage people to check it out, kind of thinking about how we can leverage these expert-based theories, approaches, so kind of leverage the neural activities. Pretty interesting stuff. But I want us to think about how we can take this a step further. And going back to developer communities per se. Some of the best, oh, it came up so early. All right, let's see, what are the best parts of the developer communities as we know it? Some of those are the just-in-time coding support, being able to get help on something right when we need it. Another is being able to kind of connect with new people, folks we haven't met before, but these people can eventually be our colleagues and collaborators on other GitHub projects, or just other projects overall. You know, people were seeking this out beyond developers, were seeking this out heavily during the pandemic, for instance. Another is being able to donate our time. I mentioned earlier, communities are really helpful for being able to give perspectives, offer insight and help to folks who don't have it, they don't have it in their room at that time. The altruism, the donation, being able to help others who are in need. And then I think one of the best parts that folks who are, you know, introverts think about a lot are the ability to disengage when you're ready. You can close the laptop, you don't have to, you can stop talking whenever you want. So these are kind of like the best attributes of communities. And then when we think about some of the current AI tools, like what are the ways that we can be leveraging them? Or are they currently leveraging or supporting the best parts of our communities? There's other tools, I mentioned Go Copilot the most, but there's also Overflow AI, which is essentially an advanced search for Stack Overflow. But they leverage and focus on your productive work, but they don't necessarily empower you as an individual beyond your work. Are there ways we can be leveraging community to do that? Can we leverage agents to help us do that? So throughout the rest of the talk, I'm probably going to be kind of expanding speculative work and thinking about, you know, how we can be using agents to help us find better opportunities to ask questions, so we can ask well-received questions. How can we use agents to kind of empower us to grow the roles? So we start off as a worker, then you turn into an active contributor, and then maybe we then go to a maintainer, for instance. Like, how do we use agents to help support and empower us to grow as active community members? And then finally, are there ways we can use agents to stumble upon communities or sub-communities, for instance? Are there new affordances new ways we can be thinking about engaging community, new modalities? And I think there's quite a few we can start thinking about overall. But again, this is more speculative. These aren't really set in stone yet, but it did resonate with this other group I kind of spoke at recently. So in the essence of thinking about how agents can help us find a community, say you're a developer and you're working on a snippet of code and you're in the flow. So we talk about flow and these metaphors for software development, but what if there was a way to actually be in the flow, join a forum where you're engaging and as you're working? The same way another way to think about it is you're in the flow of walking into a new city, right? You're walking around with friends, and you come across a new coffee shop, for instance, and you go in and actually there's a pottery class in the background, right? So you stumble upon a new community, you stumble upon a new coffee shop, and you learn about a new skill or a new pastime that you haven't engaged in. Other ways we can replicate that for developer communities, or even just beyond developer communities, other types of information work. So when I think about the development lifecycle, so maybe you're in the flow, you're working on a piece of code, and others are in the brainstorming stage. Maybe at the brainstorming stage of what that project would be, you're trying to devise what you would write about, what your code is what the output is gonna be essentially. Maybe others are actually in the coffee shop mode where you're working and you're deep focus time, and you kind of just want to be in the presence of other people working because that social facilitation is empowering you in that way. But maybe you're also at the end of your life cycle. Maybe there's a way to better support that flow of like, I'm at the end and I'm trying to share my findings and I wanna figure out how I can stumble upon new stages or new projects by being in the flow. Are there new affordances that we can be thinking about for communities? Are the communities of flow that we can better support? Is there a way when we start working, we're immediately immersed into this new setting? Beyond just a linear list of like similar questions people have asked, like what does that look like to be ambient? Can agents better support that flow? Can they better support us finding and stumbling upon that new community, discovering new settings? I think I was speaking with Sue earlier, we was talking a lot about this exploratory question solving. I can't remember the full term we were talking about, honestly, but you're in different stages of your development life cycle. How can we better support you at these different stages? And maybe that is looking at new modalities. And then finally, how can we better support that to kind of support creativity? You meet new colleagues, not just you stumble upon new communities, you also stumble across new types of work, new APIs, new libraries you can use. Because you see others doing that, you're flowing by. And ideas to think about. Another way to think about how agents can better support us across communities or within communities is with this concept of digital twins. So the Zoom CEO has talked about this before, and I have a link to the article there as well, where there's this digital twin concept of maybe we've been able to kind of extend our space for the people virtually at home. We've been able to connect over distributed spaces, but we haven't been able to connect over distributed time. So maybe you could send this digital twin, this representation of yourself, this digital extension of yourself, I should say, and to a meeting on your behalf. But this agent is an extension of you, but how do you build trust with this agent? Right?
We're all looking at each other thinking about faculty meetings. Like, go on.
Maybe that's somewhere else to be, right? So you wanna send your agent to kind of have these discrete texts that you passed on to say, I want you to make sure this comment is brought up. Because when you send the agenda beforehand, no one reads it, right? But if you have an agent that can say, oh, actually, this topic came up, let me raise my hand and engage. You know, what does that look like? How do you build trust to make sure that agent is a good representation of you? And a reasonable representation of you? And there's an MIT Tech Review article that kind of highlights that, and that's where I got these images from. So I encourage you all to check that out. Are there particular guidelines and guardrails we should be using for when we use this or when we're allowed to use this digital representation of ourselves or digital extension of ourselves? In building out those guidelines, you know, who should be the stakeholders? Who should be allowed to use these? And when they should be allowed to use these? For instance, they probably shouldn't be replicating anyone who's passed on, right? Something we've been thinking about a lot is that they should be like mimetic agents. They should be reciprocal, as in that you should be able to have a back and forth type of conversation or dialogue with them. And they should be, they're embodied because they're meant to be in a meeting. But these are different things we should be thinking about as this is just agents already exist. This is a more embodied format that people are exploring. Zoom is exploring, other companies may be exploring, I don't know, maybe where I work, I don't know. But I do want to extend, I wanted to think about, like, it's not just a bot, right? We have seen bots in communities, but because this is tied to your identity, maybe there are certain expectations your collaborators may have of you because this extension of you is there. Maybe there's certain reasons we should say, okay, we only want to send this out to people you only have a relationship with. What this will look like, but yeah. So we're exploring and thinking about what this will look like at scale, just tinkering with the idea essentially. You can imagine, like, I'm giving the example of work, but there's also opportunities to kind of use these agents in more joyous and celebrations things. So I'm leveraging that. I'm learning more about that from one of our previous works we did at DIS. So this work was about how Black technologists and software developers were building software for Black people. And we learn a lot. So people who are not familiar with my work, I learn a lot about how, I learned a lot from marginalized communities of how they built their own workarounds in these settings. And then from there, figuring out how to better support the broader community. Because the folks who have had to navigate these challenges, they had no choice but to kind of overcome challenges. But from there, we learn how to build interventions that will be helpful to them and the broader population, broader community. So in understanding how developers and technologists have built some of these tools, we learned a lot about how they built for certain concepts of survival. Designing for survival, designing for connection, culture, and this, the celebration and joy is one of those concepts that I don't think we talk about enough. We talk about like the being critical of AI agents, and we should be, and rightfully so. But there's also this to be juxtaposed with how we think about celebrating just goodness amongst challenges and strife. And what if there was an agent that better support how we do that? How we surface and celebrate moments. More on the positive side of how we build things. And there are folks thinking about it at scale. In fact, I'm sorry, the days are running together for me. Friday and Saturday this past, there was this AI summit around joy, Black Joy AI Summit, where they were thinking about what are those cultural experiences that are valuable that we don't talk about, that don't exist right now in some of these AI agents, but how can we be thinking about what it looked like at scale? And again, this actual event that was kind of organized was centered around, okay, the marginalized experiences that are cultural and bespoke to these to this particular community of Black people in America. But what was interesting and related there was like there's the concept of the arts, where people have found joy in offline spaces before, and what does that look like now for us in the broader population, which is we found joy in community around food, for instance. That was one of those highlights. Andrea Grimes-Parker did a lot of work previously at CHI that was highlighting how we communicate and find joy in food and those cultural references. So what are those cultural references that we should be leaning into to support marginalized communities, but also that support the broader community? I typically find some of the inspiration there. So I figured I'd share that as well, as a way to figure out how we've been targeting the few, but we can help the many. Other ways we can figure out how to support joy in times of strife. And then in the concept of thinking about joy or celebration, if you will, just opposed to survival, thinking about how we can be thriving rather than surviving, I should say. Other ways we can do that, centralized in our work or even beyond work. So when we think about if we're working on a challenging software development task, we're gonna close the bigger stuff. And you're like, I'm frustrated, I'm gonna leave. But maybe there's an agent that can pop up and say, hey, you've been working on this for a while, but the journey was part of the experience. And agents as a sort of reflection, if you will. Again, people are seeking these agents to help navigate challenging mental health challenges and different conditions. Other ways we can just be explicit about is empowering and uplifting people when they're frustrated with a task. I think there's a great opportunity to kind of explore that more that we don't hear about as much. And I think it would also kind of help the broader population kind of absorb and understand how AI tools can better support them beyond the fear of job loss and more. So this is the recap as I'm closing, and I know we had a difficulty, so time is kind of off, but I've talked a lot about how co-pilots we can think about communities as a source of community evaluation signals and learning from others, building up this collective sense-making muscle that communities offer. And we should be able to do that through generative AI or use the settings that people use or the communities that people use to build generative AI. That don't currently exist still. That's the note. If there's interns who want to work on that, let me know. Like there's opportunities here. And then I also want to think about there's other ways we can be using AI to further disrupt developer communities or developer plus community. People who program for help people just beyond several settings, right? How do we help people engage in Reddit forums better? People who work, but who want to contribute, right? Because there's a different type of contributor. If you're interested in participating, how do we support that? How do we navigate that safely? Can agents be a better tool for that? Additionally, online forums like ShareGPT and the Hugging Face discussion forums are really helpful for learning about how folks are navigating these tools. And I think I guess it's more of a call to action for researchers to look there and seek there and see what the latest discussions are. I always joke around and say like Stack Overflow is really like this big archive of how developers have overcome over time as new libraries emerge. All of this data is there, all these experiences are there. I know we're in information school right now, I know there's a big archivist culture here. I think there's opportunities to really think about how we can dive deep and maybe even collect and celebrate the joys as people have overcome challenges before, in earlier stages of programming and software development as well. That's just one example of doing that, but communities essentially are a place for that, and I would like to encourage folks to kind of use that more and use it as a tool that it is. And then also, as we think about different ways we can have extensions of ourselves or agents kind of empowering us in different ways. There could be agents for play. I think we talk about work a lot, information work as a software development. I know that's my traditional core research area, but there could be agents for play, agents for, effective reflection, for therapeutic purposes. Folks are already doing it, but there's ways that we can guide that better to be safer. So with that, I'll close.